So you've been beat up by your three friends, verbally abused, and then this young whippersnapper who has been eavesdropping all along to your conversation decides to jump in and tell you what to do. Have you ever had that happen to you? Well, it happened to Job, and this young man, his name is Elihu, and we're going to be talking about him on the next The Wounds of the Faithful podcast.
Welcome to the Wounds of the Faithful podcast, brought to you by DSW Ministries. Your host is singer, songwriter, speaker, and domestic violence advocate Diana Winkler. She is passionate about helping survivors in the church heal from domestic violence and abuse and trauma. This podcast is not a substitute for professional counseling or qualified medical help. Now, here is Diana.
Happy New Year once again, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Every day is a new beginning. We have a new beginning in January to start over again. And I have just one announcement before I forget. Join the private Facebook group just for our podcast here called the Wounds of the Faithful podcast group. And there's a few questions on there to answer, but you can join in with me, get to know each other, and talk about the podcast, maybe ask questions about any of the topics that we talk about. So I'm looking forward to meeting all of you. So don't forget to do that. It's brand new. We are talking this week about Elihu. Now, I thought that Elihu was one of Job's friends, but now going through this study once again, he is just been standing there listening and eavesdropping on this conversation and decides to jump in. And so that's what we're talking about today. We're continuing the series on the book of Job, of course. We are towards the end of this bad boy here. We're in chapter 32. Elihu, he was just somebody hanging around the trash heap. Who does that? They're not anywhere where people hang out and just listen to private conversations. You ever talk with somebody like that? You're talking with somebody and then somebody just comes along and butts into the conversation. They have no context about what the conversation is or who we are. They just decided to put their 2 cents into it. And that's really rude, yes. And bugs the tar out of me. You're kind of looking at them and this is an A and B conversation. See you later, right? That's exactly what Elihu does. He has been eavesdropping, hanging around. Now, he hasn't said anything up to this point because he is very young. So you got this whippersnapper. That's an old term for a young person up to no good. Older generation language. I have a lot of young listeners on the podcast, so don't take this as an attack on you. Certainly have many friends that are young. They are awesome, terrific people, but we're going to talk about what Elihu did wrong. And don't do this. You're a young person and you're speaking to somebody much older than you, has much more experience than you. Please don't do what Elihu's doing. Yes, it is rude and nobody likes that. It's very arrogant. It's very unwanted. You're not going to make any friends that way. It's not showing humility in any fashion. Even if you're right, you have something to say to somebody that's got more wisdom and respect and experience than you. Come to the conversation by permission and with some humility. That's what I would recommend. So it's great to have conversations with people that have different viewpoints than you. I'm all for that. We have to be respectful of one another. And of course, we older generation folk, the young people have a lot to offer in this world of ours. Give them a chance maybe to learn something from you. You learn something from them, right? So as always, we do a little background to see what is Elihu like. He's super spiritual, or at least he thinks he is. I have a lot to cover. This guy talks for 5 chapters. He is very long-winded. So Job's 3 fair weather friends failed to convict him of sin or to break his faith. Well, Satan wanted to break Job's faith. So at this point, they're just sitting there in silence at an impasse. Now, even at this point of the story, many Christians have abandoned their faith for much less than what Job's gone through. But Satan's got this one last trick up his sleeve. Elihu is curious. He likes theological and philosophical conversations. That's very obvious. He likes disputes and arguing. He's impressed with his own spiritual insights, and he's looking to show off his knowledge to these learned scholars that are sitting there talking. Have you ever met a Bible college student that seems to know everything? I have been one of those Bible college students. You get very puffed up in your knowledge when you are going through Bible college, and they just kind of like the Matrix. They make you inhale all of this stuff about the Bible and theology so you can pass your exams, and you feel really smart and you feel like you know everything. You've got God down to a science. I should look up that sign. My cousins and I, we used to hang out in the summer, and we were all, teenagers playing and swimming in the pool and stuff. And this is the sign. Teenagers, tired of being harassed by your parents? Act now. Move out. Get a job. Pay your own way while you still know everything. Is that hilarious or what? And I remember that sign. I'll never forget it. So Elihu's going to be jumping into the conversation with much enthusiasm with his supposedly great knowledge. He has a very high opinion of himself. So we're expecting to hear some good stuff because here's a fresh face into the conversation, right? He just rephrases what the other 3 have said, pretty much. But he also distorts Job's testimonies, and he ignores any of Job's pleas. The thing I would say about Elihu, he seemed sincere in his knowledge. Talks a lot about God's creation. How could Job possibly charge Elihu as being a liar? The Apostle Paul cautioned careful selection of pastoral leaders in 1 Timothy 3:4-6. We are all familiar with that passage, that pastors should not be novices. He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. So yeah. And you can read the rest of the things that Paul says about choosing leaders. This is 5 chapters he talks. He's not very concise in his words. I have a lot to go through, so most of this may be summarizing some things because I really don't want to spend another week on Elihu because, as I mentioned before, chapter 38 is when God finally speaks to them out of the whirlwind. So I promise you, this is the last of the people that are going to abuse Job. Job chapter 32, verses 1-5. So these 3 men ceased answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then the wrath of Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite of the family of Ram, was aroused against Job. His wrath was aroused because he justified himself rather than God. Also against his 3 friends, his wrath was aroused because they had found no answer, and yet had condemned Job. Now because they were years older than he, Elihu had wanted to speak to Job. When Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these 3 men, his wrath was aroused. So his friends had nothing more to say. It was useless to keep the discussion going. So Elihu, he appears, he dominates all the discussion, and then abruptly leaves. Elihu is the only one with a genealogy here, if you notice. He's a Buzzite. Buzz is the son of Nahor, who was the brother of Abraham. So why do we talk about genealogies and where people are from? So this talks about in my Bible notes here. City of Buz is in the region of Edom near Dedan. So up towards the north. Why is the mention of genealogy important? Who cares, right? With Jesus, it was very important. But for Elihu, it reminds us that Elihu was not a fictional character. We talked about this in the beginning of Job. Job was not a fictional character. Most scholars believe that. There are a few that do not believe that Job is a real story, that it's poetry, and that's it. But I hold that these people are real. So Elihu felt that Job was more concerned about being right himself than God being right. And he's angry at the friends because they're doing a terrible job putting Job in his place. They can't seem to refute what Job is saying. And Elihu speaks, but Job does not answer him. I mean, would you? Job really never has the opportunity to answer. Neither did the other three. Who can get a word in edgewise? Have you ever talked to somebody like that? They don't even come up for air. We'll see later next week that God doesn't take much notice of him except to interrupt him and question him. So here he is, a classic angry young man. But at least in the beginning, he's hesitant to speak because we did mention that Job's three friends are old enough to be Job's father. I don't think all of them were that old, but at least Eliphaz was. So let's read verses 6 through 9. So Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, answered and said, I am young in years, and you are very old. Therefore I was afraid and dared not declare my opinion to you. I said, Age should speak, and multitudes of years should teach wisdom. But there is a spirit in a man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding. Great men are not always wise, nor do the aged always understand justice. Elihu believes that just because Job and his three friends were older, it didn't mean that they were the only ones that received revelation from God. You aren't the only ones. Even when you're young, you have the ability to discern from good and bad. You do. That's what God puts inside of us is what we call a conscience. We know when we've done something wrong. Our whole body knows when we've done something wrong. Anyway, these three friends and Elihu, they seem to be in agreement about Job and who he was, but they are probably not in agreement that this kid could do a better job than they could. And we do know that age is not always a measure of wisdom. You and I both know some senior citizens that don't have a lick of sense. I've got some senior citizens I'm friends with that they're very foolish. If you're not applying wisdom to your life and the knowledge that you've learned over the years, then you're no better than an ignorant teenager that has no clue and just flies by the seat of his pants. But Elihu pretty much is saying here, old man, you're wrong, and me as a young man, I'm right. So let's go on to verses 10 through 14. Elihu is starting to criticize the three friends. Therefore, I say, listen to me. I will also declare my opinion. Indeed, I waited for your words. I listened to your reasonings while you searched out what to say. I paid close attention to you, and surely not one of you convinced Job or answered his words, lest you say, we have found wisdom. God will vanquish him, not man. Now he has not directed his words against me, so I will not answer him with your words. And can you imagine the look on these older men's faces? They were probably pretty sour and disgusted. We're just getting started here. But Elihu is frustrated because you guys didn't do a very good job. We can imagine Elihu standing there and just thinking, if I had the chance to answer this Job, he's rehearsing what he's going to say. Job's friends are not as brilliant in answers as his would be in Elihu's mind. Verses 15 through 22. They are dismayed and answer no more. Words escape them. And I have waited because they did not speak, because they stood still and answered no more. I also will answer my part. I too will declare my opinion, for I am full of words. The spirit within me compels me. Indeed, my belly is like wine that has no vent. It is ready to burst forth like new wineskins. I will speak that I may find relief. I must open my lips and answer. Let me not, I pray you, show partiality to anyone, nor let me flatter any man. For I do not know how to flatter, else my Maker would soon take me away. He's busting at the seams, folks. Job's friends are exhausted by the debate so far, but he has some energy and a whole lot left over, and more words to say than humanly possible. So he's going to drone on and on and on, unable to shut up. And he just spends a chapter just introducing his speech. Elihu was determined to flatter no man except himself, and he seemed painfully unaware of how ridiculous he really looked. So Elihu challenges Job first. So we're in chapter 33, verses 1 through 7. He's claiming to be the spokesman of God. But please, Job, hear my speech and listen to all my words. Now I will open my mouth. My tongue speaks in my mouth. My words come from my upright heart. My lips utter pure knowledge. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. If you can answer me, set your words in order before me. Take your stand. Truly I am your spokesman before God. I have also been formed out of clay. Surely no fear of me will terrify you, nor will my hand be heavy upon you. So already you can tell he's enormously conceited. He's got some prophetic power and he has clarity. He's got a solid knowledge base, but he's a typical youth. Verses 8 through 11. Elihu says of Job, "You think you are without sin? Surely you have spoken in my hearing. And I've heard the sound of your words, saying, I am pure, without transgression. I am innocent. There is no iniquity in me. Yet he finds occasions against me. He counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks. He watches all my paths." Now, Elihu had not really heard Job very carefully. Job did not claim that he was sinless. Now, his words were read back in chapter 6. We remember that. He said a lot of things to indicate he was not saying he was sinless. He doesn't have any known sin that would deserve what he's going through now. He says in chapter 19, verse 20, "Though I were righteous, my own mouth would condemn me. Though I were blameless, it would prove me perverse." So we'll go on to verses 12 through 18. He's talking about maybe God spoke to you in a dream, Job. "Look, in this you are not righteous. I will answer you, for God is greater than man. Why do you contend with him? For he does not give an accounting of any of his words." So Elihu speaks he's very overly wordy. He's not very precise. He's being vague. It certainly is true that God is greater than man, but that doesn't mean that Elihu should be talking to Job in this manner. Elihu is very proud and way overconfident in his own wisdom, in his analysis of the situation. But he is correct on some points, right? A broken clock is correct twice a day. So what does all this mean? We all know about a mediator from last week, that Jesus is our mediator. Where the others view suffering as punishment for sinners, Elihu sees it as correcting and healing. It's like discipline or chastening. But Elihu does not say anything that we haven't heard before so far. Elihu thought that he knew more or could explain better than the other three, but he really can't. But Job 33, 26 through 28 is a wonderful description of somebody that's genuinely turned to God. So we see that Elihu, he gets some things right. So that's why we can't quite dismiss him as, okay, there's this young, stupid kid with too much time on his hands. Yes, he's a little ridiculous, but he also says some really deep things. Verses 29 through 33. Elihu pleads with Job to listen to him. Behold, God works all of these things, twice in fact, 3 times with a man, to bring his soul back from the pit, that he may be enlightened with the light of life. Give ear, Job, listen to me. Hold your peace, and I will speak. If you have anything to say, answer me. Speak, for I desire to justify you. If not, listen to me. Hold your peace, and I will teach you wisdom. Ooh, wow. When you read that, you have no words. Like, that is very bold, brazen to say that. He's apparently the judge, jury, and executioner here. Elihu wanted Job to know that God's being very patient with you. But Job felt that God was treating him like an enemy, being very harsh. So maybe Job opened his mouth to say something to respond to this young Elihu. Or maybe Job was just rolling his eyes at this young kid. Can you imagine? I would probably roll my eyes. So we're in chapter 34, and Elihu is accusing Job for denying God's justice. So let's read verses 1 through 9. For Job has said, I am righteous, but God has taken away my justice. Should I lie concerning my right? My wound is incurable, though I am without transgression. What man is like Job, who drinks scorn like water, who goes in company with the workers of iniquity, and walks with wicked men? For he has said, it profits a man nothing that he should delight in God. So he's accusing Job of hanging out with workers of iniquity and that he's sinless. But this is a slight mischaracterization of what Job said. He never claimed to be sinless, as we've stated earlier. Elihu selected very carefully and unfairly, I might add, just picked out things that he needed in order to prove his point. Job certainly said nothing like these statements that he supposedly quoted. Again, we're talking about a man that's responding in a state of trauma. We say things from pain, maybe some things that because we're in pain and frustrated, it might be a little over the top. Verses 10 through 15. The righteous of God and his moral order, therefore listen to me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God to do wickedness, and from the Almighty to commit iniquity. For he repays man according to his work, and makes man to find a reward according to his way. Surely God would never do wickedly, nor will the Almighty perverse justice. Who gave him charge over the earth? Or who appointed him over the whole earth? If he should set his heart on it, if he should gather to himself his spirit and his breath, all flesh would perish together, and man would return to dust. So that is talking about God, of course. Elihu's talking about the same old, you always reap what you sow. And we talked about this before. Many people do believe what you reap is what you sow is an absolute spiritual law instead of a general principle, just like in Proverbs. We've talked about that a couple of times. Elihu and Job's 3 friends also assume that God would never do anything mysterious, and that these 3 are way too confident in their understanding of God and his ways. Sometimes we all can be that way. We put God into a box. Some of us put him into a genie lamp. God exists to do what I want him to do, to measure up to my expectations, to my perspective of what I think that God should be, separate from who God really is. Elihu wanted to emphasize God is independent, and God is so mighty that, Job, you are totally wrong to question God at all. I'm glad I was able to read this because many preachers have said the same thing about the study of Job. This is how I got The view of the book of Job was from preachers that say that you should never question God or doubt anything that he has said. You should never struggle. And I think they get this maybe from this chapter. Just because Elihu's stating this doesn't mean that it's wrong to question God. We are finite human beings. Our soul is eternal, but in our flesh, we are weak. We're physically weak. We're spiritually weak right now until we pass into eternity. Let's read in verses 21 through 30. For his eyes are on the ways of man, and he sees all of his steps. There is no darkness nor shadow of death, where the workers of iniquity may hide themselves. Therefore he knows their works. He overthrows them in the night. They are crushed. He strikes them as wicked men in the open sight of others, because they turned back from him and would not consider any of his ways, so that they cause the cry of the poor to come to him. For he hears the cry of the afflicted. I love this verse. For he hears the cry of the afflicted. Wicked people cause the cry of the poor to come to God. But this completely fails to explain the problem of Job's sufferings. Elihu means this as a warning for Job. God's judgment is perfect. God judges kings and princes without partiality. So he says, Job, if you don't repent of the sin that prompted this whole crisis, then you can be certain that God's going to judge you as one who turned back from him. The message of Elihu to Job was clear. God always does right. But applying that to Job's situation was wrong. But Elihu still has more advice for Job, very strong advice. Verses 31 through 33. This is what Job should have said, according to Elihu. For has anyone said to God, I have borne chastening, I will offend no more. Teach me what I do not see. If I have done iniquity, I will do no more. So, humble repentance, that's what you should have done, Job. Take your discipline like a man, right? Promise not to offend anymore. Don't do it again. Be humble, submit. Elihu saw none of this in Job, and it was very offensive to him. It made Elihu angry. He was criticizing what he thought was Job's arrogance. Should God be just what you think he should be and do just what you think he should do? So his conclusion is, Job, you are to blame for what you got, the situation you're in. It's your own fault. Don't we get that a lot from people when we are suffering, that people blame us when maybe it wasn't our fault? He's delivering ultimatums and pressure, and he's pressing on Job. The scene is so painful to watch, isn't it? This kid really thinks he's helping Job. That's what's painful. But he says Job's sins invited God's judgment. Let's look at verses 34 through 37. Men of understanding say to me, wise men who listen to me, Job speaks without knowledge. His words are without wisdom. Oh, that Job were tried to the utmost, because his answers are like those of wicked men. For he adds rebellion to his sin. He claps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God. Who? This was the common opinion of Job's three friends, and now Elihu. Elihu thought, Job, you haven't suffered enough. Now you're adding rebellion to your sin, Job. So let's see here. He's being very severe at this point, more than the last three. So we're in chapter 35, verses 1 through 3. Elihu said to Job, are you more righteous than God? Moreover, Elihu answered and said, do you think this is right? Do you say, my righteousness is more than God's? He's getting more aggressive. You can imagine him walking up to Job and sticking his finger on his chest and pointing. Self-righteous Job should expect no answer from God, he says. Let's look at verses 13 through 16. Elihu's pretty much stating here, God doesn't want to hear your empty words. Surely God will not listen to empty talk, nor will the Almighty regard it. Although you say you do not see him, yet justice is before him. And you must wait for him. And now, because he has not punished in his anger, nor taken much notice of folly. Therefore Job opens his mouth in vain. He multiplies words without knowledge. Elihu is accusing Job, stating, God didn't hear Job because he is a false, empty seeker. You're not really a believer, Job. You're just faking it. If Job would only be patient, then Job would see God, whom he claimed was hidden from him. Job, if you really were a godly man, then God would have answered you by now. The fact that he didn't, the fact that he hasn't, proves that you're ungodly. That's a huge slap in the face, isn't it? Whew. Wow. We have chapter 36. We got 2 more chapters. The ending, I think, is really interesting. You're going to really like the ending to Elihu's speech here. So we are in 36. Let's start out with verses 1 through 4. Elihu also proceeded and said, Bear with me a little, and I will show you that there are yet words to speak on God's behalf. I will fetch my knowledge from afar. I will ascribe righteousness to my Maker, for truly my words are not false. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you. So I'm sure that those that were listening to his long-windedness and droning on and on with his condemnation, they're getting uncomfortable. We're getting uncomfortable. But he begs them to keep listening and insists that he's speaking on God's behalf. Here he is speaking with a directness that Job's friends did not use. He also spoke with an authority that Job's other friends didn't seem to have. But if you ever listen to a really long and dreary sermon, it's kind of monotonous and it's really boring and it's past your lunchtime and they just keep going and going and going and there's no point to any of this. That's what Elihu sounds like. So they keep listening. Sure, he's got some prophetic gifts, but even if you have a direct revelation from God, that doesn't make you perfect in knowledge. So let's read verses 5 through 12. Behold, God is mighty, but despises no one. He is mighty in strength of understanding. He does not preserve the life of the wicked, but gives justice to the oppressed. He does not withdraw his eyes from the righteous, but they are on the throne with kings. For he has seated them forever, and they are exalted. And if they are bound in fetters, held in the cords of affliction, then he tells them their work and their transgressions, that they have acted defiantly. He also opens their ear to instruction, and commands that they turn from iniquity. If they obey and serve him, they shall spend their days in prosperity, and their years in pleasures. But if they do not obey, they shall perish by the sword, and they shall die without knowledge. So in Elihu's mind, the freedom God has for the righteous does not belong to Job because Job isn't among the righteous. What's an example of somebody that suffered and he didn't do anything wrong? Well, you know this if you've listened to the podcast. One of them is Joseph. We did a whole series on Joseph, my favorite Old Testament saint. He was a great example of a person who was treated unjustly more than once, suffered greatly, suffered for many, many years. But then he was restored not only to save the land from starvation, but he prospered in many, many ways. So Elihu warned Job to repent and not to be like people who are disobedient. Let's go on to verses 13 through 15. But the hypocrites in heart store up wrath. They do not cry for help when he binds them. They die in youth, and their life ends among the perverted persons. He delivers the poor in their affliction and opens their ears in oppression. Perverted persons, that's basically a general term for somebody in open sin who doesn't repent. They die in youth. It's interesting that he mentions they die in youth because he's young himself. Interesting. So Job was a hypocrite for continuing to deny his guilt. And he ensures, Job, you don't have a very nice future ahead of you. You might want to repent. So keep in mind, chapters 1 and 2 make it very clear that Elihu is absolutely wrong in this analysis of Job's life. And let's talk about the rich for a second. Elihu assumes, and many people assume, that all of the rich put their trust in riches. All of the rich are wicked, they're greedy. That's not necessarily true. I know some rich people that they're very generous in giving to the Lord's work. They're frugal. They don't boast in their riches. They don't flash it. They don't have the typical lifestyle that you would connect with a very rich person. And so I think that is true of Job here, is that it's wrong for Elihu to assume that he was trusting in his riches. He wasn't, because in the beginning of the book of Job, it talks about him offering sacrifices just in case he or his children were sinning ignorantly. So Job, all this suffering and agony is your choice. And what it demanded was that Job forsake his integrity and make a show of repentance just to please his friends, just to get them off his back, to make this whole thing end. And Job had his own faults during his dialogue with his friends. He lashed back out in anger at some of his treatment. Well, of course, he always repented of that. And I've never seen this before any of my studies of the book of Job until now. There is a rapidly approaching storm with rain, wind, and thunder and dark clouds. And he is watching this rapidly approaching storm and saying all of these things. He starts to get inspired by watching this storm come. And we've all seen approaching storms, right? Elihu is speaking in a very different way now, who is focusing on what's going on around him right now. He's a bit distracted, and he has no clue that this approaching storm is where God is. God is coming to speak to them out of the whirlwind here shortly. So he's describing this storm. I just have never noticed that there was a storm coming and that God was in the storm. Have you? There's always new things to notice in scripture. So Job and Elihu have different responses to the Lord's approach. The more mature man of faith is silent, but Elihu keeps on jibber-jabbing, pontificating, droning on and on, likes to hear himself talk, even if it is inspired by the nature around him. It's quite a bit of a contrast with the humble silence of Job, don't you think? So Elihu is going to go on about the unsearchable greatness of God. And yes, God is great. Let's read 26 through 23. Behold, God is great, and we do not know him, nor can the number of his years be discovered. For he draws upon drops of water, which distill as rain from the mist, which the clouds drop down and pour abundantly on man. Indeed, can anyone understand the spreading of clouds? The thunder from his canopy. Look, he scatters his light upon it and covers the depths of the sea. For these he judges the peoples. He gives food in abundance. He covers his hands with lightning and commands it to strike. His thunder declares it. I love the word pictures, the descriptions. Can you just imagine what's going on in front of him? And what's interesting here, most people don't really point this out. Elihu analyzed the water cycle of evaporation distillation and rain, and used it as an example of God's brilliance and beauty as a designer. There are a lot of references to scientific concepts here in the book of Job. I didn't really mention a whole lot of them because my podcast isn't really about science. There may be a lot more examples when God speaks, but I really like seeing this in the book of Job, which again is one of the oldest books in the Bible next to the first middle half of Genesis. So, and he mentions thunder and lightning. So traditionally, in many, many cultures, whenever the noise of thunder is heard, it's always considered to be the voice of God. And the flash of lightning, we use the term acts of God, or we make that joke about, well, maybe not a joke, but when your kids are young and they're afraid of the lightning and the thunder, we say, oh, God's up in heaven bowling. That's what that noise is. It's nothing to be afraid of. And we say things to comfort our kids who don't understand nature. But yeah, even adults, they say that these are acts of God. So let's go to chapter 37. This is the last chapter. We're on the tail end here. Hang in here with me. Chapter 37, verses 1 through 5. This is where Elihu sees God in the storm. He's describing this all. At this also my heart trembles and leaps from its place. Hear attentively the thunder of his voice and the rumbling that comes from his mouth. He sends it forth under the whole heaven, his lightning to the ends of the earth. After it, a voice roars. He thunders with his majestic voice, and he does not restrain them when his voice is heard. God thunders marvelously with his voice. He does great things which we cannot comprehend. Yeah, no other sound in nature more descriptive of the majesty of God than thunder. And there are lots of descriptions of the thunderstorm in the Bible. Psalm 29 is one of the best examples. And then most commentaries would say Elihu's poem comes a close second. You can read Psalm 29 on your own. Due to time, I'm not going to read that. So what can the voice of God do? Let's read verses 6 through 13, where he says to the snow, fall on the earth, likewise to the gentle rain and the heavy rain of his strength. He seals the hand of every man, that all men may know his work. The beasts go down to dens and remain in their lairs. From the chamber of the south comes the whirlwind, and the cold from the scattering winds of the north. By the breath of God, ice is given, and the broad winters and the broad waters are frozen. Also with moisture, he saturates the thick clouds. He scatters his bright clouds, and they swirl about, being turned by his guidance, that they may do whatever he commands them on the face of the whole earth. He causes it to come, whether for correction or for his land, or for mercy. So you see here where he switches from the thundering voice of God to now he thinks that the voice of God commanded the snow, the gentle rain, and the heavy rain. And he mentions that when the snow comes or heavy rains come, they can't do their work. Most of us have been through a snowstorm that it was so heavy that you couldn't do anything. You couldn't leave your house. And Elihu is stating that these are intended to observe the works of God, to rest and see the majesty of God. I remember being married to my ex-husband. This was our first anniversary, and we went to Lancaster, Pennsylvania to stay at a bed and breakfast. And we got 36 inches of snow that storm, and we were snowed in. Now we had plenty of food and books and music to entertain us. I remember my ex being very bored. And so the Amish, who are very hard workers, they're very accustomed to physical labor. The women were out in the front of the bed and breakfast shoveling a pathway and shoveling out people's cars. He was so bored that he went outside and helped them shovel while he was listening to the playoffs on his radio. It was probably 3 extra days of staying at the bed and breakfast before we could go home. And I was having a good time reading and play the piano and, of course, sing. So we were just playing music and singing and reading books and eating, and it was wonderful. It was restful. I just remember he was just did not like to sit still too long and just look at the beautiful snow. Anyhow, so Elihu's saying unrepentant Job should submit to God the way that his creation does. All right, so here's Elihu's final words to Job, verses 14 through 18. And he pretty much is telling him at this point, you don't know as much as you think you know. Listen to this, O Job. Stand still and consider the wondrous works of God. He's talking to Job in a very direct and personal way. He's trying to convince Job that he's very ignorant. At verses 19 through 24, and this is his last hurrah. He's basically saying, stop trying to speak to God and fear him instead. If a man were to speak, surely he would be swallowed up. With God is awesome majesty. As for the Almighty, we cannot find him. He is excellent in power, in judgment, and abundant justice. He does not oppress. Therefore men fear him. He shows no partiality to any who are wise of heart. Also, verse 24, he does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit. So he's challenging Job's arrogance or a justification from God. Job, if you insist that God owes us an audience, then please teach us what we should say to him. He wanted to discourage Job from insisting that God owed him or anyone else an audience or an explanation. So think of those words for next week, because all of this stuff that he said before God comes and speaks out of that storm that headed towards them. What a surprise. It was time for God to finally break his silence. And there are definitely some things that God needs to address here. But Job's suffering is finally over. So thanks for hanging in there this week, and sorry for going over. It was really a challenge to condense 5 chapters into 30 minutes. So I did the best that I could. So next week, we're going to do, what does Job say to God? I'm really excited about this. There are some really great truths. So I appreciate you being here with me. Again, Happy New Year. Don't forget to join the Facebook group so we can chit chat. And God bless you. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Wounds of the Faithful podcast. If this episode has been helpful to you, please hit the subscribe button and tell a friend. You can connect with us at dswministries.org, where you'll find our blog along with our Facebook, Twitter, and our YouTube channel links. Hope to see you next week.